In the summer of last year, I shared an article provided by an organization called America Space. And by the way, I find most of their content to be extremely well researched and reliable. But the article was arguing, or at least putting forward the possibility, that Starship might not ever be able to transport humans to the moon or Mars, and especially would be incapable of delivering human beings to the surface of the moon in time for Artemis 3 to beat the Chinese to the lunar surface. Just out of interest, I decided to go ahead and check America Space again to see if they had updated their opinions, and interestingly enough, just a couple of weeks ago and days before the latest debacle with Starship, they did indeed express their opinions about the Starship HLS, the challenges it's facing right now, and their recommendations for an alternative method of perhaps getting humans to the moon by 2029, which does not involve the Starship HLS program. And this is what I found to be especially unique and compelling about their content. Although they believe that Starship will not be able to reach maturity before 2030, at least in terms of putting human beings on the lunar surface and elsewhere, it could be involved in an alternate solution that involves several launch providers rather than just SpaceX. The solution is innovative and, in my opinion, a very compelling one. One of the few solutions, in my opinion, that will get the job done in time. It utilizes some of Starship's strengths, at least as we understand them right now, without expecting too much from this rocket too soon. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Bulletin. Today, it's time to talk about Starship again. Yes, I've been talking about Starship a lot lately compared to how much I've discussed it in recent months. Haven't really focused on it nearly as much as I am now, but when it comes right down to it, I've taken some time to look at the state of Starship's development, to look at how much has been accomplished in the 2 years, actually over 2 years now, that has elapsed since Starship's first test flight. And I think at this point, it's time for us to start facing some facts. For a very long time, I have maintained with a great deal of confidence that SpaceX would eventually solve all the problems with Starship, and that Starship would revolutionize spaceflight throughout the solar system. I no longer believe this, at least not with 100% certainty as I used to. I'm beginning to wonder whether or not Starship's development can ever get to the point from where it is now after 10 failed test flights. Yes, I know there's only been 9 officially, but I mean, let's think about it for a moment. The 10th test flight has failed also simply because the orbiter exploded before they even got a chance to put it on the launch pad. So really, when it comes down to it, we have 10 failed test flights, with the orbiter, for the most part, being responsible for the failure of all of these test flights, or the vast majority of them. And I think in many ways, that's the crux of the matter. If we were looking at Starship as just sort of a super Falcon 9 instead, a Falcon 9 with a much bigger payload capacity, a Falcon 9 with a much bigger fairing, that sort of thing, this would still be a revolutionary rocket. And in many respects, Starship has accomplished all of the same things that Falcon 9 has. As a matter of fact, it's accomplished things that Falcon 9 hasn't accomplished, such as the amazing catch maneuvers with the booster. Super Heavy is doing very, very well indeed. SpaceX has been very good at making their reusable boosters successful over the years, and it's looking like Super Heavy might be moving in that direction as well. As I said, it's accomplished many impressive things, but it is the orbiter where all of the problems exist. And to imagine that somehow Starship is going to advance from where it is now to a rocket that's going to be able to carry out 10, maybe 11 refueling maneuvers in quick succession in low Earth orbit, to return to Earth repeatedly with a reusable heat shield and then launch again, tanker after tanker, just to get the rocket, just to get the orbiter out of low Earth orbit, because it's so heavy. That's the only way it can get out of low Earth orbit, is to refuel it completely, because it uses virtually every drop of fuel it has to get to orbit in the first place. So we got to look at why is all of this really necessary? Why is it so difficult to make the orbiter successful when the booster has achieved such a high degree of success at a much earlier stage in the project's development? And if the orbiter never really matures to what Elon wants to become, a completely reusable heavy lift orbiter, and not just that, but an orbiter that will land on the moon, land on Mars, transport dozens and hundreds, maybe even thousands of people to other planets, along with thousands of tons of cargo. If it never achieves any of these things, will Starship still revolutionize spaceflight? Well, the answer to that question is yes, and perhaps it's about time to start looking at those possibilities. In the spaceflight community, it can be fashionable to support one company or agency at the expense of others. Even well-known journalists, including myself by the way, often display favoritism towards SpaceX or Blue Origin, towards traditional defense contractors or entrepreneurial firms, or towards human or robotic missions. Aerospace is arguably a more tribal field now than at any point in its history to date. There is nothing inherently wrong with this trend. It's a natural consequence of the growth of the industry and the proliferation of alternative media. However, we cannot lose sight of the fact that all of our favorite entities ultimately serve a larger cause, one which has grave implications for every single one of us. When senior editor Jim Hillhouse founded this outlet 18 years ago, he did not name it Old Space or New Space. He just named it America Space. And America's space program is in serious trouble. While some experts are still loath to recognize it, the United States leadership in space is being threatened for the first time in 60 years. While NASA's flagship Artemis program has encountered delays, the China National Space Agency, or CNSA, has quietly advanced its own lunar architecture. Its Mengzhou crew capsule completed an uncrewed test flight in 2019, and a full-scale prototype of its Longyue lander is undergoing thermal and vacuum testing, and its Long March 10 moon rocket is derived from Long March 5, which has flown 14 times with just one failure. China's simple, disciplined approach has several advantages over the Artemis program of record. It requires just 2 launches, eliminating the need for orbital refueling. It uses hypergolic propellants, which were used in Apollo and are today used in Orion, rather than cryogenic fuel and oxidizer, which require refrigeration to avoid boil-off. And finally, it stages out of a low lunar orbit rather than a near rectilinear halo orbit, which reduces the duration of the mission and leads to more frequent abort opportunities. CNSA's stated goal is to land 2 of its taikonauts on the moon prior to 2030, which implies that the landing will most likely take place in 2029. Because of China's progress, it is possible, perhaps even probable, that the next voice heard from the moon room will be speaking in Mandarin. This concerning state of affairs is now a subject of debate in the halls of Congress. During the confirmation hearing for NASA Administrator nominee Jared Isaacman, who now, of course, is not going to be doing the job in spite of the fact that he was well liked by both sides of the aisle, but all that having been said, Ted Cruz, the leader of the Senate Space Subcommittee, Maria Cantwell, his Democratic counterpart, and Isaacman himself recognized that winning the moon race is NASA's most important priority, even as the agency sets its sights on Mars. Looking at the Artemis architecture, some elements of the program are in better shape than others. The SLS rocket and Orion spacecraft are being considered for termination following Artemis 3, the program's first lunar landing. It is true that these systems are expensive, but Orion and SLS are operational, and for the foreseeable future, they are the only way to send astronauts beyond low Earth orbit. Barring any serious issues with Artemis 2, there is no reason to expect that they will not be available in time for a lunar landing in 2028. Less information is available on Axiom's lunar spacesuit, which the astronauts will wear on the lunar surface. However, prototypes of the suit are already being tested in NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory, and the design heavily leverages NASA's pre-existing advanced spacesuit designs. Instead, the pacing appears to be on the Human Landing System, or HLS, in other words, Lunar Starship, despite the fact that landing on the moon is arguably the most challenging portion of the Artemis 3 mission profile. The lander is the element which received the latest start. The first HLS contract was awarded in 2021, which means that the vehicle must be operational within 7 years to ensure victory in the emerging moon race. By the way, can you see how ridiculous it was in 2021 to think that there was any chance that we would be landing on the moon by 2024 as the original contract specified? But let's continue. To make matters worse, NASA did not select an ordinary lander for Artemis 3. That's an understatement. On paper, SpaceX's Starship promises extraordinary performance as its manufacturer claims that it will be able to land up to 100 tons of cargo on the moon. However, Starship's development has progressed more gradually, and by the way, this was written before the most recent static fire debacle, than NASA and SpaceX had hoped. To be fair, the program has reached some impressive milestones. Most notably, SpaceX guided Starship's first stage, the most powerful rocket booster ever built, back to its launch site and caught it with 2 mechanical arms on the gantry tower. It was an unforgettable moment. I agree, by the way, and that's why Super Heavy should be part of a lunar mission, but Lunar Starship should not. But let's continue with the article. Quote, unfortunately, the development of the second stage, which will ultimately evolve into the lunar variant of Starship, has not kept pace. On Tuesday, May 27th, as we all know, the version 2 variant of Starship, which was supposed to rectify the system's performance issues, failed for a third consecutive time. Shortly after its engines cut off, it tumbled out of control and re-entered Earth's atmosphere. Even after Starship reaches orbit, which was supposed to be the straightforward part of the development program, it must demonstrate the ability to transfer hundreds of tons of cryogenic propellant between ships in orbit, store that propellant without boil off for up to 100 days, and land on the rugged lunar surface without tipping over. And by the way, these skinny, tall lunar landers with narrow landing gear setups, which by the way aren't nearly as top heavy as Starship will ultimately be, have yet to successfully land on the lunar surface. The only lunar landers, part of the CLPS program anyway, that have successfully landed on the moon have been traditional squat lunar landers with a wide landing gear setup. I don't see how Starship will ever be able to successfully set down safely on the moon with astronauts on board. But let's go ahead and continue. Thousands of talented engineers are working long hours to help Starship realize realize its potential, and it remains possible that it will mature into a reliable system. However, it is simply unreasonable to expect any team, however capable, to pull off a miracle and land a Starship-class vehicle on the moon before the Langway lander is ready to fly. Testimony by Dr. Brian Durbacher and Dr. Scott Pace in a hearing on February 26, 2025 before the House Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics left little doubt that the Chinese will beat the United States to the moon. Under questioning by Representative Keith Self, Pace and Durbacher expressed skepticism that SpaceX will meet its HLS contract obligations to land astronauts on the moon by 2027 or even by 2030. In a typical NASA commercial program, a second provider is supposed to take over and complete the mission if the industry leader flounders. A shining example is how SpaceX's Crew Dragon covered for Boeing's Starliner, which encountered a range of issues before it received the highest ratings of any commercial crew program. However, the second HLS contractor, Blue Origin, was only awarded funding in 2023, 2 years after SpaceX. Like SpaceX, Blue Origin has reached some noteworthy milestones. During an interview on 60 Minutes in March of 2024, John Koulouris, Blue Origin's Senior Vice President of Lunar Permanence, said that a subscale Mark I Blue Moon prototype would be ready to land on the moon in 12 to 16 months. Many in the aerospace community were skeptical of such an aggressive claim at the time, but lately it appears that Blue Moon will be ready to fly by August or September of this year. However, the human-scale Blue Moon Mark II shares Starship's architectural complexity as it heavily leverages orbital refueling. Blue Moon's hydrogen and oxygen propellants, which must be launched by at least 4 tankers, will be delivered to lunar orbit by a reusable cislunar transporter. Prior to its first lunar mission, Blue Origin must develop a lander, a tanker, and the cislunar transporter itself. In the long term, Blue Origin's architecture could enable a range of missions, but it is, once again, unlikely to be ready by 2029 or probably 2030, if not later. In short, NASA and its contractors need to find a way to simplify the HLS architecture and bring a crewed lander into service at an earlier date. As NASA's Encyclopedia of Lunar Lander Concept Studies demonstrates, there are many strategies which could result in a positive outcome. So let's go ahead and look at an existence proof for an HLS-derived vehicle that could accomplish a lunar landing by the end of 2028. By the way, it involves Starship, but a far more basic and fundamental Starship than the one that Elon has envisioned for the future. A Starship that is not reusable, a Starship that will only be launched once, and a Starship that takes advantage of its heavy cargo capabilities and its large fairing size to deliver a very large payload, which we'll look at in just a moment. And it will be a lot easier for Starship to do this if its upper stage does not have a heavy heat shield. Keep in mind, you're not trying to reuse the thing, so it doesn't have to have all those heavy heat tiles, ablative heat shield, everything else to make it survive. Instead, the objective with this thing is to get its cargo into orbit once. So let's have a look at the architecture. First of all, look at the design principles. Number 1, the lander must be available by the end of 2028. The CNSA has not published a date for its first crewed landing. Therefore, until we hear otherwise, we must assume that it could take place at any point within 2029. Number 2, the architecture should maximize the use of hardware which either exists or is in development. This minimizes the potential for delays. It lowers the cost of what will be, by definition, an interim solution preparation for lunar landings. Securing funding for a clean sheet lander is unlikely in the current budgetary environment. And number 3, the lander should be capable of completing its mission with a single launch. In-space assembly and orbital refueling both require significant complexity and high launch cadences, which place a 2028 landing at risk. When we survey the commercial space industry with these requirements in mind, a handful of observations become apparent. SpaceX has a large, cheap launch vehicle, but no lander to put on top of it. Blue Origin has a small lander, but no rocket which can send it directly to the moon. United Launch Alliance, which has an extremely efficient upper stage, but when it flies on the standard Vulcan rocket, it consumes most of its propellant before reaching orbit. By the way, this is the ULA Centaur 5 upper stage that we're talking about here. With these precepts in mind, a feasible architecture comes into focus. Let's have a look at the diagram of that. As the launch date for Artemis 3 approaches, an expendable variant of SpaceX's Starship will place a lunar lander stack into a stable low Earth orbit. This stack consists of a fully fueled Centaur 5 acting as an Earth departure stage and a Blue Moon Mark II lander. The Blue Moon has been stripped of 3 tons of dry mass so that it can be propelled directly to the moon by Centaur 5 while still completing its mission without refueling. Once Blue Moon arrives in a near rectilinear halo orbit, the Artemis 3 crew will depart for the moon inside an Orion capsule. Orion will dock directly to the Blue Moon instead of using the Gateway Space Station, which is scheduled for cancellation right now, as an intermediary. From this point onwards, the mission profile is essentially identical to the current Artemis 5 mission concept, with Blue Moon landing 2 astronauts on the lunar surface and returning them safely to the Orion following the conclusion of the mission. All of the math which describes this mission profile is included in the article, by the way, which I have linked in the description if you want to check it and confirm that none of this is violating the laws of physics. Because Super Heavy can propel the entire stack, Centaur 5 and Blue Moon, into low Earth orbit, the Centaur 5 only needs to perform the translunar injection or TLI burn, which requires 3,200 meters per second of delta V. The 4 RL-10 engines on Centaur 5 may be 60 years old, but they also have one of the highest ISPs in the industry, 465.5 seconds. The stage has a dry mass of 5.5 tons, and it carries 54 metric tons of propellant. That is why Centaur is such an effective upper stage. Over 90% of its mass is propellant. The combined mass of a fully fueled Centaur 5 and the modified Blue Moon is approximately 107,113 kilograms. This is larger than Starship's theoretical 100-ton payload, but you can really make up for that by, again, removing heat tiles, removing all of the aerodynamic control flaps that are necessary for landing. You don't need those either. You can definitely reduce Starship's weight considerably, which is one of the major things that have been impacting its performance up to this point. The upper stage of Starship is just way too heavy right now. Between all of the stainless steel, the heat shield, all of the necessary control flaps, and everything else that is necessary to make this thing reusable, Starship has not performed up to its capabilities right now, meaning that so much has had to be stripped out of the propulsion system in order to lighten the load enough to try to make everything balance out, that the entire contraption just becomes a little too brittle, and that's why you've been having all of these leaks, all of these fires, engine failures, etc. A stripped down upper stage would really take a lot of stress off of the entire structure of the rocket and increase its payload capability, and yet still it would have enormous capabilities in spite of that. We're talking about a rocket that still has a reusable first stage, therefore reusing 33 out of its 39 engines and propelling 100 metric tons up to low Earth orbit. And once again, this could be extended to other types of missions as well. Think of how enormous of a Mars transport ship you could build in low Earth orbit if you're transporting 100 metric tons worth of structure up at a time. You could build an enormous ship in low Earth orbit that way without having to put unnecessary stress on Starship. Just use Starship as a heavy transporter up to low Earth orbit, at least for now, and that's it. And you can get a lot out of this rocket without trying to make it do too much. The article closes thusly. In recent months, the United States' defeat in the new space race has been treated as a given, but fortunately, this outcome is not yet inevitable. NASA still has several key advantages over CNSA, including a 5-year head start and the availability of key mission elements such as SLS and Orion, assuming we don't just get rid of them. As we have shown in this article, there is at least one architecture which can place Americans on the moon before 2029 without requiring a new program or Apollo-like increase in funding. Other options may exist, but NASA and its political stakeholders will need to act quickly to take advantage of them. The window for action is closing, and as little as 4 years remain before the first crewed Chinese landing. Only by working together as one nation will we be able to win the moon race and preserve our future amongst the stars. So thanks very much for watching. Really appreciate it. Once again, I want to keep thanking folks who have been supporting my upcoming trip to Australia. Really looking forward to that. Coming up on September 11th is when I will be departing the United Kingdom and heading for Sydney. And I've raised 57% of our goal up to this point because of you folks, because of your generous donations. It's amazing. I never expected that we would be at this point so quickly, and we're on the home stretch. If you'd like to contribute to my trip to Australia, all the details in the description. Contribute to our GoFundMe, or you can buy a piece of merchandise or join us on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay angry about space.